So today we're going to talk about what happens when we respond to learners, and this session is born out of a session I did last year for Dimitri, and Elena, were you involved in the conference as well last year? And it's some work that I've been doing the last, well, probably since 2014, but more recently, some research I've been doing with a colleague of mine on how we respond to learners' output, how we help learners with what they're trying to say. And I'm going to demystify this term that you probably hear, and if you read one of Hugh Deller's books, he uses this term, but it originally comes from Scott Thornberry's movement called dogma in English language teaching, or dogma ELT. And this term emergent language, which people hear a lot but don't really know what it is. So we're going to start by demystifying what this term is. My interest as a language teacher is in methodology in general, but where my specific interest is, what I'm really interested in, is what happens in the classroom in terms of interaction. When learners are talking to each other, or when the teacher is interacting with the learners, what's happening in these exchanges? How is the learner possibly getting something, some new knowledge or some new input, through these interactions? In today's session, emergent language can be looked at in lots and lots of ways, but we're going to concentrate on learners' oral production and what the teacher does in response to this oral production in today's session. And specifically what we're going to look at is what is emergent, or sometimes it's called emerging in some, the Cambridge Delta criteria, for example, calls it emerging language. And then we're going to have a look at how we as teachers develop our skills to respond to learners. So two simple things in today's session. And then hopefully there'll be a little bit of time for discussion at the end. So how I see it in a language lesson, there are two types of language. First type of language is the language that we've been talking about a lot on this course. It's the language that you're going to teach the learners, the language that the syllabus requires us to teach. If we open the course book, the focus of the unit is the present perfect, or the focus of the unit is the future continuous for future, the present continuous for future plans, or something like that. So it's prescribed language that we set out that we want to teach. Okay, now we've talked about that in other sessions. We talked about that in the session on speaking when we looked at phonology. We've talked about that in the first session on grammar when we looked at kinds of grammar that we might want to introduce to our learners. And we talked about lexis and how we might want to introduce specific lexis to our students. However, in today's session, we're going to talk about a different kind of language. And this is what many have called or coined this metaphor, emerging or emergent language. Okay, what do we mean by this? Let's look at some definitions before we get to the practical stuff. So definition one is one that myself and my colleague Melissa Lamb came up with when we were working with some teachers back in 2014, and we blogged about it. And our definition is emergent language is language that features in the lesson, which is unplanned, and it emerges in a lesson due to the learner's need for linguistic input in order to communicate an idea. Okay, so we chose this verb need. When the learners need to know something, then the teacher supplies it. But I think it can be looked at a bit more generally, as we'll look at in a minute. But that's how we saw it in 2014. This happens when the learners are interacting communicatively amongst themselves, so when the students are talking, or when they're in dialogic exchanges with the teacher. When the teacher's saying that learners, and they're having a discussion, maybe a negotiation of meaning of some sort. So that's what we mean by emergent language. It's not what the course book is telling us to teach. It's when it comes up in the lesson unexpectedly. And as teachers, we deal with this all the time. But here's the name for what you do when you deal with this. Yeah. Nick Andon and Danny Norrington Davies, who are my colleagues at King's and International House as well, with Danny, in 2019 excuse me, in 2019, they say that the emergent language can be a number of things. And one of the things they said it can be is errors or communicative breakdowns produced by the learners. So when our learners make an error, what we traditionally call error correction can be subsumed by this term emergent language. Because as teachers, we know when we're dealing with what learners say, we're not only dealing with errors, we're dealing with much more. We're also dealing with when the student says something, you've got an intermediate student or an elementary student, and they say something, and you want to push them to say something more, to encode their meaning in a more complex way, then this is also emergent language. Because the learner hasn't necessarily made an error, but we want to give them something more. We want to push them beyond what they can do already. And we'll look at this in a moment. It's also sometimes as teachers, when you're in class and you're listening to students speak and you go, there's a gap in their knowledge. Right. Okay. When they finish speaking, the learners haven't made any mistakes that you want to correct, but there's a gap. You think there's an opportunity, a window of opportunity where you can teach the learner something useful regarding what they've just said. Sometimes, if you noticed it in class, when students are talking across class, a student says something and another student says, What did you say? That's interesting. And then you put that up on the board as well. And then it becomes a point of discussion. So sometimes emergent language, again, it's not just errors, it's alternative ways we can give students to say things, but it's an opportunity. When we judge, it might be useful to introduce some language to our students that we know well at this point. Or it might be a moment where something pops up that we want to deal with some language. But the classic one is something that happens all the time in class. When students say, Teacher, what does this mean? Yeah. So when the student has a question about an aspect of language, this is also emergent language, because generally all of these different things, errors, alternatives, language the teacher judges to be new in some way or interesting or useful, or the learners judge to be useful, interesting, or questions that the students come up with, these aren't things that we've necessarily planned to deal with. We might have, with our experience of our class and knowing them, and knowing our intermediate learners or our advanced learners or our pre-intermediate or beginner learners, we might naturally, as teachers, with our episodic experience of the classroom, we might predict some of these things, but we don't necessarily plan to teach them. Yeah. It's not language that's in the course book or in the syllabus that we've decided to teach. These are things that happen in the moment. Yeah. So we might predict a little bit about some of these things, that some of these things could happen, but it's when they happen unexpectedly, or if they happen when we predicted them, we deal with them. Does that make sense? So that's what we mean by emergent language. Yeah. Let's take this a bit further. So what do we do as a teacher when these moments happen in class, these magical moments of things we haven't planned? And they're often, in my experience, the more exciting bits to teach. Do you ever find that? These moments when it's like, now I'm teaching because the learners really want to know something. What the teacher does is to reformulate learner utterances. Yeah. Okay. So it could be you reformulate a learner utterance, or you might put something new on the board. But what do we mean by reformulation? Okay. So reformulation by the teacher is originally my colleague Melissa Lamb and I came up with this definition. So I'll let you read this. So we wrote this back in 2014. Yeah. Jim Scrivener, is anyone familiar with Jim Scrivener? Remember Jim Scrivener from, very well-known methodology books, and Adrian Underhill, who's one of the trustees of International House where I work, and they both worked for International House in the past. They came up with this term, upgrading learners' language. So a bit like, on a computer or, on a flight. I think I asked Adrian, where did this term upgrade come from? And he said it came from You know, when you're getting a flight somewhere and you can upgrade from passenger to normal class. What's it called? Economy class to to business class. You can upgrade, and it's a bit like I think this metaphor, this idea of upgrade, works quite well for me because you're pushing the learners to move beyond what they can do already. Yeah. So at International House, this term is stuck. So we talk about upgrading language quite a lot. But what do we mean by upgrade? Well, I think there's an issue actually with the definition that I gave you before from 2014, and I'd like to revise it. And one of the questions is that my colleague and once tutor when I did my MA at King's College London, Martin Dewey, would say there's a problem with this word natural. What do we mean by natural? Because it's a subjective word. I mean, most of the words we'll choose are subjective, but the word natural does encapsulate this kind of native speaker idea of what's natural. And that's problematic, in my opinion. I'll explain that a little bit further. Sometimes our goal, as language learners, me as a Spanish learner, is to fool the listeners into not thinking that I'm British and that I could be from somewhere else, because they're never going to believe I'm from Spain. Yeah, but it's to fool. But so what do we mean by natural? It's a very highly subjective word. In hindsight of this, what I would like to change the word for is complex. And the reason I've chosen the word complex is because the learners can do what they can at their particular level, their particular stage of their interlanguage, where they're at developmentally, where they're at with their language. But as teachers, if we take the Vygotskian, back to my hero that we've talked about a lot, there's this idea of Vygotsky of language being a stretch a little bit above where the learners are. The task encouraging the learner to move beyond what they can already do. This idea of complex for me works. This word might not work for you, but this is the one that I've settled on at the moment from where we were at. And this is the one that I added for the conference before. But this idea that we're generally moving the learner on in terms of their development, their individual development. And that's problematic because how many students do we have in a class? Where are they at individually? Are they all in different spaces, different places? How do we respond to that as teachers? And we'll come to that point in a moment. So I work with quite a lot of teachers and experienced teachers as well, very experienced teachers like yourselves, and new teachers, and teachers on Delta courses and teachers on master's courses and whatever. And these are some of the problems that they say that they have with this idea of emergent language and not just going in and teaching your lesson regardless of what the students need to know. Some teachers have said there isn't enough time for this because I've got to teach them the the future perfect continuous by the end of this class. I've got to teach them this lexical set, and we talked about how tricky lexical sets can be in terms of memorizing things in the past. And some teachers might say there isn't enough time for this, this other stuff. I would argue and say it's actually part of what we do. And I think if we examine what we do in our classes normally as teachers, experienced teachers, we all do it. But maybe we don't give enough value to it. That's a question. And this is something coming from a teacher, because I'm a teacher, obviously. My journey in the last 10 years of learning about emergent language and learning to deal with it in class, and not thinking, oh, we have to get to the end of page 57 because we've got to get through the past perfect and all the narrative tenses by the end of the class. Actually, it's having those moments where you stop and you listen to the learners. And actually, from target language that we're teaching can spring emergent language as well. Yeah. When learners have questions that suddenly take us in a different direction that we weren't expecting. Do you get what I mean? So what should we focus on is another question teachers say. I mean, students say, oh, have loads of errors, especially my elementary learners. They have, where do I start? Do I pick up on everything they say? Am I selective? What do I select? I think it's a good question. And again, there's not an easy answer to that one, because as teachers of our classes, we know what we're going to pick up on. We know what's going to be useful for our learners. And that's the skill of the teacher. What's going to admit, Kate? And then teachers say, well, what do I do? You know, some emergent language comes up, something comes up in class, the students ask a really good question, or what do I do with it when I've got it? I can write it on the board, and then do we move on, or how much time do I spend on this? Yeah, a valid question, I think. One of the teachers that I interviewed as part of a study I did a little while ago said that, oh, well, that's just an aside. It just comes up in the lesson. It's not important. It just comes up. But have you noticed what happens in class when emergent language comes up? Have you noticed what the students do? A notebook moment, you know, when we're in a physical classroom, it's more difficult online, but you see students start writing things down. I'm going to shut up for a minute because I've talked a lot. And the question I want to ask is, why do students write down emergent language? I mean, they write down all sorts of things, target language. You know, if they're good students, they write things down. But when I'm sitting at the back of the classroom and I'm watching teachers teach, why do you think I notice that they're writing down emergent language in this kind of hurried way? Really experienced teachers I've worked with on Delta, and even experienced teachers that I've worked with in the staff from International House, would say emergent language is difficult to deal with. Sometimes I avoid it. Yeah. Or, you know, newer teachers think, I've only just worked out how to explain the past simple. What are you asking me to do? But actually, it's the most natural thing to do. If the students have a question, is to respond to it. You're all in the very comfortable position of understanding all of the grammar and lots about English language. So you can respond to your students very easily. Imagine a native speaker doing a CELTA course. They're terrified of it because they haven't learned the language themselves. Okay, so we're going to address some of these issues. Now, I want to address a term that annoys me a little bit, but it's around everywhere. We see it. I'm sure you use it yourselves. This term, native speaker or non-native speaker, these two terms. And, you know, I mean, I couldn't, you know, to use a really idiomatic English, but I couldn't give a monkeys. Do you know this one? I couldn't give a monkeys about, you know, whether you're native or non-native speaker, because it really doesn't matter. As I said before, you know, watching these CELTA trainees that are native speakers who are terrified of language, and then you get a Russian teacher who's been teaching for 5 years coming to do a CELTA in London, and you're like, thank God, can you just explain the grammar to this this English person? So I mean, these are problematic terms: native speaker, non-native speaker. What I would like to call us all, I mean, I am a native speaker by birth, however, we're expert users, all of us. Yeah. And I'm sure in some ways you're probably more expert than me in some of the language that you teach that I'm not familiar with, and some of the genres that you might be familiar with. You know, who teaches business English? Elena, I know that business English is not my area. So you'd be more of an expert speaker of English with business English than me, I'm sure. And in much safer hands your students would be than with me. Yeah. So this is how I see it. You know, this native non-native speaker divide. I find it an issue, you know, a non-issue really. But unfortunately, in lots of places in the world, you know, if English isn't your first language, then you come across this horrible problem of you're not a native speaker. Well, you know my opinion on it. As you know, L1 speakers like me and expert users of the language, all of us, and this is what my research revealed that I did with teachers who had English as their first language and their second language, all of us can help. All we can do as teachers is to help the learners wherever we're able to. Yeah. As we're the more knowledgeable other in the room, that's all we can do. When I was a new teacher and I didn't, you know, as a native speaker, didn't understand the grammar, and the student asked me what a past participle was, and I froze on the spot. I didn't know what to say. Nodding. even at that point, I was trying to help the student with what she was trying to say. I couldn't help her with the terminology. So wherever we're at, with our teachers, if you supervise other teachers and ourselves as teachers, wherever we're at in our development, we help the learners wherever we can. Yeah, so that's the basis that we're coming from with emergent language. Some of us might be able to do with it in a more expert way than others, but that takes a lot of practice. It took me a lot of practice to deal with it. Teachers have to select from their linguistic resources, the knowledge we've got about language, and our knowledge of pedagogic ways of doing things in class. Yeah. But I'm a firm believer, if we take skills acquisition theory that we talked about before, that practice builds confidence. And that's a process that I've gone on myself about learning about this. And it's like anything new you learn, isn't it? Think about learning English yourselves. It might have been a very long time ago, or learning another language. But that process of acquiring a skill, taking some risks, trying it out, and it builds some confidence, because when we try things, it provides us with data. This works, this doesn't work. God, that was a mess. Oh, next time, but it mustn't put me off. Next time I won't make such a mess of it. Or or that really confused me, or I really confused the student, which is what I've done before. You've had that feeling? I've really confused you, student. I'm so sorry. But all of these experiences build to our confidence to deal with things in the future. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to confuse a student again next time. So we're doing a new video project at International House at the moment. And I taught a class I've never met before. They were intermediate, and I was plunged into the class, and I did a grammaring with them, 5-sentence grammaring. But there were parts in that class, because you're not prepared and because you're thinking on your feet. Yeah, you're thinking in the moment. You're thinking on your feet. It's not always that clear. So it's messy. That's fine, because it's a negotiation. There were bits I came away from afterwards going, oh God, maybe I should have. But actually, it's not a problem. That's teaching. Teaching is a messy business, because if we're dealing with what's important to the learners in that moment in time, then we're working in their zone of proximal development. Back to our Vygotsky idea. We might be dealing with Krashen's idea of an I+1, giving them input a little bit above where they're at in order to help them. So have a go at it is what I'm saying. Now, it's very easy for me to sit here and say, right, go and have a go at emergent language. It'll be fun. And everyone's going, well, what is it? How do you do it? Well, I'm going to show you. Okay, so we're going to look at some very practical things that you can do to develop your reactive skills to your students. But first of all, a little bit of theory. I won't bang on about this, but I want to give you a little bit of background to why not only target language is important, but emergent language is important in a lesson. Yeah, and why, in terms of applied linguistic research, why it's important. And firstly, a huge meta-analyses by Spada and Kang and others have said that looking at language-focused and meaning-focused learning, this can lead to greater learning. Okay, so their analysis of lots of studies say that if we look at language when it's situated in meaning, this can lead to more learning. Yeah, okay, and from very reputable people. Ellis says this, and I think this is interesting. That's when he's talking about, I think, task-based learning, but certainly when things become noticeable for students. Yeah, when students notice things, when learners become aware of a gap in their existing L2 performance or LX performance, how many other languages they speak, which prevents them from expressing what they want to express, they're sensitized to attend to any input containing the forms they need. It's important in the moment to them. And that's exactly what Marina said, isn't it? At that, why do they write it down? It's important to them in that moment. And Long would say what happens is a reactive intervention from the teacher, from us intervening in that moment. It responds to the learner's internal syllabus, not the syllabus that we've planned to teach them, but the learner's internal sound like a preacher, the learner's internal syllabus at that moment in time when they're ready for some input and they're ready for our intervention. Now, there is a problem with this. Do we preempt things a little bit too quickly sometimes as teachers? Do we decide what the students want to say when it's not what the student wants to say? So we need to ask ourselves this question, and we need to negotiate with the learner. And a criticism of emergent language is that the teacher decides what the learner's trying to say. So we have to be involved dialogically. Again, another famous Russian, Bakhtin, talked about this idea of dialogic learning, that the idea that we're engaged in a dialogue and it's a negotiation in order to come to an understanding. And for me, that's what teaching is. One aspect is probably the major aspect of teaching. The rest of it we can plan, and we can possibly predict some of the dialogic aspects, but we can't really plan it because it's the unplanned stuff that's more memorable to our learners. I don't know if anyone's agreeing with me here or not. I'm talking a lot because I'm very excited about this. Sorry. Okay, and the last point I'd like to make is that in feedback, and Ellis would say there's a consensus that feedback on language can learn to learners developing linguistically. So by giving learners clear feedback on stuff, development can come from this. Now, we're not saying that they're going to learn what you want them to learn, but actually, if we provide an opportunity for the learners to learn what they want to learn from us and use the teacher as a resource, then our feedback can be much more powerful. It's very prevalent, this idea of emergent language, in things like task-based learning that we talked about in the speaking session. In Dogma ELT, which is where you don't use a course book and it's a conversationally driven approach to teaching. Does anyone teach conversation classes? Anybody teach conversation classes where you don't have a course book? So if you're teaching a conversation class, you don't have a course book, you go in there, how was your weekend? And then, as Jim Scrivener calls it, I think in his book, a jungle path lesson. You kind of hack your way through and you find your way through the lesson rather than our neat, maybe, river journey or road journey that we've planned in our lesson plan from our course book. And then there are other approaches like CLIL. I don't know if anyone teaches content and language integrated learning. So this is very much based on emergent language as well. I mean, there are a language that we want to teach, which is called content obligatory language. There's content compatible language that we might want to teach. But actually, when I've been talking to teachers and observing teachers doing content teaching, loads of other stuff comes up that you didn't plan to teach because the content's there. So if we have meaning, forms are needed to help us make meaning. So these approaches in language teaching would be very much on the side of emergent language. But what I'm arguing for today is that we can add it to our PPP lesson. We can add it to our general lessons that we teach. It's just about cutting back up maybe on what we need to teach and allowing some room, breathing space. I talk about it on Delta a lot. Breathing space in our lessons to actually really respond to our learners and for things to happen naturally. Okay. I'm talking a lot, but I'm going to get to some practical bits in a minute, I promise. So this is Danny, my colleague, and he's been doing quite a lot of work with it and with emergent language and research into it. And I really like this quote from Danny's, I think it was a talk he did a little while ago that I went to, and he said, so emergent language is a thing. Have you heard this term before, emergent language? Give me a thumbs up if you heard it before. Okay, but it's enigmatic, isn't it? It's kind of like, oh yeah, emergent language. I think I know what it is, but your idea of it might be different to my idea of it, and Marina's idea might be different to Elena's idea. So we started to look at it, and the problem is there's little concrete guidance that's been published on working with emergent language, and there's little published research on how teachers currently work with emergent language in lessons. There's loads of stuff on error correction, but what about all the other stuff that we talked about? How often do you do this in class where the student asks you a question, you give them the word, the translation perhaps, or the student says, but why do I use this like this? What situation can I, and we respond all of the time to the student. Very little research done into any of this. In fact, there's been a big paper, Jim McKinley at UCL and others have written, and it's focused on teachers and corrective feedback. So it's just one element of this rather large area that we call emergent language, yeah, in terms of language teaching. So you can't, the only book I think actually is Hugh Deller's book and Andrew Walkley's book, Teaching Lexically, have got one page on this. Obviously, Scott Thornbury and Luke Medding's book is where they coined the term or put the term into popular usage. Their book, Teaching Unplugged. But nobody tells you how to deal with it. Nobody tells you what do you do with it when you have it. So that's what we're going to have a look at now. Because as we looked at some questions from teachers before, teachers like, okay, it's all very well and good, this nebulous term, emergent language. What do you actually do with it? How do you deal with it when the student says something or when you notice a gap? So that's what we're going to have a look at. Okay, and I'm going to give you some practical tools today that you can walk away with and either work together or work with teachers that you work with, or things that you can do on your own in terms of building your confidence with dealing with emergent language. So Nick Andon, my colleague at King's, he's just retired, was the head of was the director for the MAT. So him and Danny started doing some research on the nature of emergent language, and we're going to look at how that feeds into things that you can do yourself when looking at it. And I've been looking at what we as teachers do, how we can reflect on our own practice with some very, very simple ways. Yeah, practical ways. Because I'm a teacher, I don't want to spend hours and hours looking at myself when I've been teaching all day. The last thing I want to do is go home and scratch my head and go, no, where was that bit of emergent? So let's look at some practical things that we can do that are easy in terms of our development. Okay, so development idea one, and you're going to go to breakout rooms in a minute. I'm conscious that I've been talking a lot, but that's the background. That's I'm setting up my stall here. These are the things that we can do. Okay, so the first activity before we go to breakout rooms, I'll show you. And this is to help sensitize yourself to learn a language, which you probably are sensitized to your learners anyway, because you're experienced teachers, you teach them all the time. They could be any age from, children to adults. Yeah. Okay. But probably the exchanges that we have might be looked at in a different way when students are more cognitively developed, such as teenagers or adult learners. Okay. And there are different things that we do in class, believe it or not. So I just want to talk through a couple of these things. So, for example, if we look at the left-hand column, okay, an explicit reformulation is where you might take something the learner has said, and that can be in the moment, say, stop, hang on, you said this, do you want to say this? And this would be an explicit reformulation. Or we might put an error on the board and say to the learners, okay, who can correct this one? Yeah, so this would be an explicit reformulation. A recast in Danny Norrington Davies' typology, or taxonomy rather, and Nick Andon's, can mean different things in different literature. But what we mean it by, what we mean by a recast is, for example, when the learner says to you, okay, who can help me out here? I'm going to make an error. Can you just say, do what a recast is? Anyone? So I goed there yesterday. Oh, you went there yesterday. Yeah, when the teacher echoes back the correction, we would call this a recast. The third one on our column is teacher clarification or confirmation request. So you know when the student says something and you think, what? What do you say? Okay, but you don't do it like that. You might go, so okay, so do you mean this or do you mean that? Ah, you mean this. So it's when we start negotiating meaning with the learners, and we might want to check that we've got their intended meaning, and then we can maybe reformulate what they've said. Yeah, we do this all the time with students. Certainly, if we're using English as a medium of instruction. Yeah, because not all classes we do. Some classes you might use translation and whatnot. There are other ways of doing that. We might give learners metalinguistic feedback. So, for example, the student says, I goed there yesterday. No, it's not goed, it's went. You need to use the past simple here. So we give it's an explicit reformulation, but we're giving metalinguistic knowledge to the students. We're using language about language in order to help the students understand it. Or we might elicit from the learners. Yeah. So we might have, for example, on the board, I listen to the learners and they make a mistake. Or I listen to the learners and they say, and I put go in brackets, I go gap there yesterday. What word goes in the gap? I go there yesterday. What word goes in the gap on the board? Went, for example, yeah? So this is an elicitation, whether we put it on the board, whether we gesture from the learners, whether we use our fingers to highlight what word goes in. I there yesterday. Yeah, I there yesterday. So we might use our fingers to draw learners' attention to some language. Yeah, okay, so that's elicitation. So what we can do as teachers, you can use this very simple tally sheet for when you're teaching. You could video yourself. It's really easy to do on Zoom now these days if you're teaching on Zoom. And you can note down the number of instances of each of these things happening in your lesson. You can look at where in the lesson do these things happen. Yeah. And you can look at whether the student uptake, and student uptake could be the students just nodding and acknowledging something, but certainly if they're writing something down in their books, or if they say it back to you, yeah, then this is a very visible sign that the students have noticed what you've drawn attention to. So, okay, things like this I've been doing, I'm about to start doing with watching myself teach, and it's pretty horrible watching yourself teach. I don't know, do you ever do it? I personally hate watching myself teach. However, it's really useful. That's the fact of the matter. It's really useful. And using a simple task like this, when you watch yourself back, can take the focus off, what I get is the embarrassment of my voice. What am I doing with my face? Am I pulling, how many wrinkles have I got? All of these things takes takes the focus off all of those things. And I'm actually looking at things that I'm doing in my teaching. Yeah. And I can start to have a look at what's on here. So hopefully in a few weeks' time, I'll be able to, in a more educated way, having used this particular task, be able to pinpoint some of these things in my own teaching. Yeah. What we might want to do is to contrast what we do in the classroom, face-to-face classroom. Oh, you've got a cat behind you, Marina. How cute. What it might have a look at what we do in the classroom and what we do online. I think there's something to be said about that. Are there different interaction patterns that happen online to what happened in the face-to-face classroom? Something that we need to discover. I don't know the answer to that, but I have a suspicion, having taught a few online classes, that this might be the case. Okay, so we could use this task, and we talked about using video. Yeah, I would say video yourself, or if you've got a little team of teachers you work with, or a teaching buddy, video each other and have a look at it together, have a look at your recordings together, because the problem is lots of commercially produced videos, and I'd include the IH videos in here from about 15 years ago. That I mean, not all of them. I mean, this Melissa Lamb's writing one, which is very out there and whatever and whatnot. But a lot of the teaching videos, like on the Jim Scrivener and the Jeremy Harmer series, teachers were told that someone's coming into my class. Here's a class, go and teach it. Now teach this, and the teacher's obviously prepared, because it's embarrassing, isn't it, or nerve-wracking when someone comes in to watch you teach. So there's lots of display of technique in lots of these teaching videos. What we're working on at IH at the moment is trying to get away from that and, excuse me, trying to make some videos that are warts and all. Do you know this expression, warts and all? Messy teaching, real teaching, the kind of teaching we do in everyday life. So hopefully we'll have these available in the near future for people to look at. So I'd recommend, in the meantime, record an experienced teacher and isolate moments of genuine interaction where the teacher works with emergent language and explore that little section, just that section. You don't have to look at the whole lesson. Use the task that we just looked at. It's also in a paper by Danny Norrington Davies that I can, but it's actually my paper, I can send to you at the end of this session. Yeah, use this one when you're watching yourself or watching your colleagues, because it's really enlightening when we see what we're really doing in class, because there are all sorts of different things going on and habits that we get into when we're teaching. So, I mean, really the purpose for this is that, we're raising awareness of what we do in class. Today, we're focusing on emergent language, but videoing yourself in general, you can look at a multitude of different things in your teaching. How do you clarify language? How do you deal with phonology? All of these things, is it on the spot, or is it to do with what you've planned in your lesson plan? The other thing you can do is to sensitize yourself to learn a language in another way, okay? And the way I would do this is a very simple activity, yeah? And you can use this task. This is the easiest one, and this is one that I've used most because, as I say, I'm a teacher as well. I don't do an awful lot of it at the moment, but when I do, this has helped me. Teachers I've worked with, who I've interviewed, who've used this activity, have found this one more useful than most. Really simple. Okay, I can't deal with emergent language. What do I do? Okay, in my notebook, I write down I put two columns. The first column is, what did the learner say? The second column is, and we can all answer this question, what would I say? Or, what was the learner trying to say? Okay, now I was teaching an intermediate class, upper intermediate class, so B2 level learners, and I wrote down these three things. Imagine you've got an upper intermediate class, and I'm not necessarily error correcting, but I want to push them. I want to give them more to say. How could I reformulate this language? I don't like people who tell your secret. These are things that I might say to learners, but all of the options that you had, Lilia and James, thank you for those. All of these are possible. I mean, these are things I came up with in response to these learner utterances. Yeah, I don't like it when people can't keep a secret. So we can look at a grammatical pattern as well. It's not just lexis. When people can't do X. Yeah, this is what we talked about with the lexis session. The syntagmatic, looking at a sentence, what's possible? As Lilia said, unconscious something. Yeah. So these are all things that pop up in a lesson, and very often I'm not aware of them till I've written them on the board or I've typed them out. And it's hard to do. I'm not pretending it's not. I've got quite good at it, and I will admit it, but I spent a bloody long time getting good at it, and I still mess it up sometimes. But it's this idea of practice and confidence. Yeah. Okay, so this is an example of what you can do when you're monitoring and when you're listening to learners. Yeah. You can note things down while they're busy talking. Then you can think about, okay, now how am I going to reform? What's the reformulation for this? What am I going to tell them? What am I going to give them in feedback? And while they're busy, you can write this up on the board. In fact, you can actually put this exact thing on the board. This is what you said. Here are some alternatives. And you could elicit some alternatives from them. Like we did, like, with James said, I said, what else can you say? James said, divulge. What else? Spill the beans. Lilia said, unconscious. So we could elicit these things and look at what's possible and what's not. A bit like we said in the grammaring, the feedback to the grammaring. The grammaring's more controlled because you've got text that you're reconstructing. This, you're not reconstructing a text, you're dealing with things that come out of a text that the learners have created together. Okay, let's do this for real. Have you got a notebook? Get a piece of paper, and we're going to do this activity. Here is a student. Okay, draw a line down the middle. I want you to listen to the learner. Okay, and normally what I would do, if I were doing this with a group of teachers for teacher training purposes, normally we'd just listen to him talk and say, what level do you think he is? But because you're really experienced teachers and we're running short on time, listen to him talk. And I want you to write down things that you notice. So transcribe things that you notice that you might want to pick up on. You don't just transcribe. Yeah. What do you hear? What strikes you as, no, gap? Yeah, as you're listening.
Let's talk about some different things then. Let's talk about your routine, your daily routine.
Yeah.
What do you usually have for breakfast?
I usually drink a cup of milk with and I eat pan au chocolat.
Okay.
Something like that, yeah.
Nice. And how do you normally get to school in the mornings in London?
I get to school in 7:45.
Okay. And how do you get here?
I'll get with underground.
Okay. Yeah. Do you like the underground?
Yeah, it's okay. It's sometimes it's really crowded and packed, but it's very efficient.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think it's expensive?
It's a little bit expensive. It's 4 times more than my country.
Is it?
Yeah.
Wow.
A weekly ticket here is amount equivalent in my country.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's really expensive comparatively. Okay. Have you enjoyed being in London?
Yeah, it is a great experience. I'm really enjoyed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen the city. It's a great city, and I like it.
Yeah, me too. If your friend was coming to study in London, what would you tell them to bring in their suitcase?
To bring less clothes than me.
Okay.
Because I have done a very big luggage with too much clothes.
Okay.
Because I was a little bit scared about the weather.
Right.
Because in August sometimes it's very hot, but it will going to rain sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I bring too much stuff to reduce my baggage, but to bring with themselves. I don't know, a credit card. You don't have to be scared about to bring with you a credit card or mobile phone in pocket. Only to be sure that you have with yourself, and nothing special. If you have a guide tour, it's better.
Yeah, that would be useful.
Yeah.
Pretty good, isn't he? So really simple task, super simple. So we watched him talk. These are some of the things that, there's loads you could pick up on, but these are some battles I chose to fight. Yeah. Okay. If you think about it that way as well. Okay. I love the second one. I've done a very big luggage. It sounds like, something really rude, doesn't it? It's not really what he means. I get what he means, but if we wanted to push him on, give him a more complex way of saying it for his level, then we might say something, rather than looking at the look at the verb and look at the collocation, have a cup of milk. Yeah. Is it have a cup of milk or have a glass of milk? I'd say glass, I think, probably. Back to what would I say? I'd say glass. So these are questions we can always answer because we're the more knowledgeable other from wherever we're at. Even if, we're working with teachers whose level of English is lower, if they're teaching students that are lower than them, well, at least they're giving them something that's above the level that they're at. That's my feeling on it. I've done a big luggage. I packed I packed too much luggage, maybe. I packed a lot of luggage. I think he's probably trying to say I packed too much luggage, but I don't know. I'm not sure. And because I haven't got the student, this was recorded about 4 years ago. I can't have the negotiation with the student. I say, do you mean was it a lot, too much? Okay, right. You say this. I packed too much luggage. So do you see what I mean? We can't just decide on what I can write this down here, but we can't just decide on it because the student's not here to negotiate with. But at least when we look at this by ourselves, we can think about what the possibilities are. And actually, what it can train us to do as well is to ask the question, what should I have asked that student? Next time, what do I need to ask the student? And then we start preempting, we start predicting. We're not sure of the answer, but we're training ourselves to think critically, I suppose, about what learners are saying. Yeah, so we can respond. And this is why it's a complex, advanced skill of teaching. Yeah, it's really complex. There's so many things that we're doing when we're dealing with this kind of language. So we're relying on so many parts of our knowledge and so many techniques that we've honed over years, and we have to use them in orchestration. Yeah, like as if you were conducting an orchestra. And this one here, I think one group said this. Scared's a bit dramatic, isn't it? You don't have to worry about. Yeah, scared. It's a bit, So we can explore language lexically, grammatically, yeah, phonologically as well in feedback, if that's something that comes up. So you can do this by observing colleagues or in live observations. You can do it in the moment when you're monitoring. Yeah, you can do it delayed using video, or you can get a teacher videoing, or do it yourselves and everyone observe and have a look at it. And it's not about critiquing, but it's about looking at the learners and tuning into their language and training ourselves to think about different ways of responding. And for me, that was a stretch. So I was very used to routines that I did naturally. Things like I echoed a lot more than I thought I did when I first recorded myself. Echo, when the student says, you went there, oh, you went there, and it actually closes the student down. Yeah, so funny things that you become aware of that you don't notice when you video yourself teaching, or looking at others teaching as well. The idea for this, it can show you what's possible. So move you beyond routines that you might have fallen into as a teacher. And I'm certainly, I've benefited from moving beyond the things that I normally do. When I interviewed somebody, they said this. They said, suddenly I thought, actually, that's not an aside. That's important. And I really got a lot from that. One of my participants said this. People felt that they had more agency. They felt like that they were allowed to deal with emergent language and not have to just rush on and deal with the target language. Yeah, lots of ways we look at language. Learning language in a linear fashion isn't necessarily the way that languages are learned in lots of perspectives. And the teachers that I talked to were more likely to make time for emergent language after doing these kinds of activities that we've looked at. The other thing you can do is take a photograph of your board. Yeah. Here, this is a discussion I had with some intermediate learners about what did you do at the weekend. So they were multilingual learners, Spanish, Italian, Chinese. And I think the student said, yeah, we went to the Tate Modern. So I said, okay, so you can say this. We went for a look. Does anyone know what this word is in this box? No? Around the Tate Modern. So you can elicit to draw attention to language. See if the learners know it, but as soon as you elicit, you're creating space for them to notice. Yeah, I'm not a fan. Modern art. What goes in the gap? Does anyone know? Okay, yes, it's of. It goes here. So we can use the other students' knowledge as well to draw attention to things that we want to focus on in class. We can look at the phonology of language on the board as well. What do you notice about this sound here? We had a look, we had a look, we had a look. What happens here? Hadda, hadda, hadda. So we might help the students notice this. So it provides an opportunity to draw attention to language that we didn't necessarily plan to teach. And as teachers, we all know how to do this. But it's valid, it's important work that we're doing, it's teaching. Yeah, and I'd say it's often the real teaching, the bits that they're writing down and remembering. Okay, but that's my opinion. I'm not basing that on any research. Techniques you can use. Board chunks of language, like we looked at in the lecture session, and gap parts of it and elicit what goes in the gap. Clarify the meaning and the use of language the way that we looked at with the lecture session. Yeah, is this formal? Is it scared? Is it too dramatic? Or what's a more neutral way of saying this? Worried. Okay, how do I feel if I'm worried? So we might explore language with clarification questions to check that the learners understand it. What situation can I say this in? Give me an example. We can drill, get learners to repeat language. Repetition, get them to have a think about it. Remember all the repetition techniques we looked at, like silent drilling? Say it, listen to it, hear it in your head, say it to yourself in your head, say it out loud, say it to your partner in breakout rooms or whatever. Yeah. And look at the form on the board. What little word goes here? What kind of word is this? The meta language. It's a verb. Okay. What comes after it? Okay. What do we call this? It's a collocation. Yeah. Verb noun. So we can draw attention to form as well in the feedback. What you need to do to get better at dealing with this kind of language, because we all do it, it's a natural thing we do in language, but to get better at it or to hone your skills in it, is to examine what you do with emergent language. And I say video is probably the best way of doing it, but observing a colleague is also possible. Look at the types of language that you're focusing on. Is it lots of lexis? Is there any grammar there? What kind of phonology, are you dealing with? Yeah, okay. And then look at the technique that you're using. Are you using gaps? Or are you telling the students everything? Are you not eliciting enough? Yeah? Are you explaining a lot? Are you working with the learners or not? Have a look at that. Yeah? There's a blog post I'll give you a link to at the end that me and Melissa wrote, Mrs. Lamb wrote in 2014, that's got some more ideas. I think we're in a very exciting zone at the moment. I mean, I've got to say, I miss the physical classroom. Are you teaching face to face? Yeah. Well, lucky you. I haven't taught a face to face class since November. But I think with Zoom, there's the possibility of videoing yourself. It makes it easier. You can hear the students much more easily than you can, if I'm honest, in a normal classroom. Yeah, you can't listen to everyone at once. You have to put your attention somewhere for a little while. It gives you an opportunity to take notes. You can use the chat box as a subtle way of giving feedback to learners. Yeah. Turn taking can be more balanced, I found, in online learning. In the classroom, the students will start shouting at once if you're lucky enough to have that kind of class. If not, dragging it out of people. And it's easy to make permanent visual record of language. So I type as I'm going along on a Word document or a Google Docs, and I give them the Google Doc. I just call it useful language or new language, and any emergent language I put in a Google Doc that the learners can then keep. One thing you can do is if you feel funny about writing it online, some colleagues were just writing it and just showing students what they'd written. Bit old-fashioned, that, isn't it? Certainly if you've got not millennial, Gen X, what's the one after that? Gen Z? Our teenage learners who are sort of in their early teens might think you're ridiculous for writing it down when you can just type it. Yeah. So things to think about with our teens, I suppose. The last one, I'm just going to share one idea with you. We're not going to do this idea because we are up with time, but creating the conditions, you can do an emergent language lesson in a very simple way. You could show students a picture, ask them some questions, get them to discuss, give them some feedback on emergent language in the way that we've looked at on the board. You could, this one I've done with older teenagers, and it's worked very well. This particular picture, I can send it to you if you want. I found it online. Imagine you could press play. What are they saying to each other? Now write the dialogue. Super simple. Requires no planning. Does require some preparation, Marina, yeah? Okay, so back to Marina's thing. It requires preparation. You've got to get the picture. But the scary bit is I'm going to have to reformulate. I'm going to have to give the students feedback on this afterwards. The not scary bit is that the students are very busy being creative with language. They're grammaring, they're exploring the limits of the language, linguistic resources they've got. They'll call you over and say, teacher, how do you say X, Y, Z? Yeah. So it provides all of these moments where everyone's busy on task for the teacher to be helpful in the moment, but you can also wait to the end, take some language and reformulate it at the end as well. So an activity like this, which is so simple, it can take an hour and a half. You could get the hot seat the student, hot seating, you get the students to be the characters, then you ask them some questions. So these drama activities, these creative activities, these grammaring activities that we looked at before, the replication activities, the transposition activities, they all afford opportunities for teaching our learners something that's new to them, something that's at the edge of what they know, yeah, at their learning edge. So what I would say is have a go at these kind of activities. We don't have time to look at them today, but this is an elementary class who produced this dialogue. If we had time today, we'd have a look at what they'd written and how we could reformulate some of their language. So what I'm saying is take a balanced approach. I'm not saying don't do target language at all, but I'm saying, I'm not saying Scott Thornbury dogma as an extreme, burn the course books and deal with conversationally driven lessons only. That would be exhausting. Actually, if I had to do that every day when I was teaching every day, it's exhausting. But as he would admit now himself, I've heard him talk about or what people have called dogma moments. So moments in class where we look for those opportunities where lessons can become dialogic or conversationally driven. Yeah, those moments, and it's the fun bits of class very often. So include work on both, but allow breathing space for emergent language. React to your learners' output. Yeah, these are all advanced skills in teaching. So, they take practice. Even experienced teachers, which I think I'm pretty experienced, 17 years in, even or 18 years in, or whatever, I always forget how long it is. Even experienced teachers, old dogs like me, need to maybe question what we're doing when we're teaching and become aware of what we're doing, because all of these tics and habits and techniques that we rely on we might need to move beyond that sometimes. Yeah, because my repertoire can become very fixed and it might be effective, but why not move beyond it? That's why teaching is interesting, because none of us have solved it. We're all here on a course. I'm here talking about stuff because I haven't solved it, and I'm exploring it, and that's what's fascinating about teaching. Training and support is essential. So if you're not sure, contact me. I can help. If not, contact your line manager. Ask for help with it. Buddy up with somebody. Excuse me. It's hard to do on your own. I did a lot of this work on my own, but I also worked with colleagues on courses, and we're lucky enough to do some team teaching. When you can team teach, that's when you go, oh, that's how you do that. Oh, well, I wouldn't do that like that. It's, which is fine, but it helps you get some perspective of what you do as well, and explore opportunities with online learning in the environment that we're working in at the moment.